Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is extraordinary support in extraordinary times. It's the knowledge and expertise to harness opportunities. Can do is empowering you to get your plans back on track. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 26th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Russia recognising the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk, then launching an invasion of Ukraine, all COVID restrictions coming to an end in England, and the death of music entrepreneur Jamal Edwards at the age of 31. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from The Week magazine is editor Theo Tait, from The Economist science correspondent Alok Jha, and from the refugee podcast Integrate That, which has just launched its second season this week. Congratulations, Abdul. It is Abdulwahab Tahhan. And just to say before we get going, you may have noticed there is a rather big news story going on at the moment, the outbreak of war in Europe, and it can feel quite odd in such moments when we cling to our format of ignoring what is evidently thought to be the biggest story of the week to bring you some alternatives. But just as during the outbreak of coronavirus, when we were talking about Arctic chlamydia and harvesting static electricity from leaves, we hope you appreciate us providing you with an alternative. So, Abdul, with that in mind, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
Dual nationals might cause a duel between the United States and China.
American athlete Eileen Gu announced she will compete for China in the 2022 Winter Olympic Games. The 18-year-old skier, who was born and raised in San Francisco, shocked the American ski community, there is one, with her switch to Team China.
Fox News star Gregory Gutfeld with his hot take on American athlete Eileen Gu representing China at the Winter Olympics. Abdul, the Olympics ended this week. What's happened?
Well, after the Olympic has ended this week, a lot of articles came out about attacking a very famous San Francisco-born Chinese-American athlete called Eileen Gu, who decided to represent China instead of the United States in the Olympics and has won 3 medals. She's being called a traitor in the United States by the United States press because she represented the United States in 2018, 2019, and then decided to represent China in the Olympics.
Yeah, so this wasn't a case of, she wouldn't have been admitted to the American team. The American team probably wanted her. She really did choose to be represented by China. Why do you think she did that, first of all?
She claims to have chosen China because she wanted to inspire millions of girls and encourage women's sport. These are her words, and these are the reasons she decided. And because she has heritage, because her mom is Chinese, and she was raised by her mom by her grandmother from her mom's side. A lot of people have accused her of choosing sides because of the money, because of the endorsements that she's got, and before becoming the darling of the brands in China. She's now the face of, I think, more than 20 luxury brands in China and all the endorsements that she's got. So she's making a lot of money out of it.
Yeah, so the suggestion is that, she made this decision for the money, effectively. But Theo, she wasn't the only person that is a naturalised Chinese citizen competing for China. There were others, weren't there? Why do you think there's fuss around her?
Well, I think in the other cases it was mostly because I think they did it so that they would get a chance to compete. And in her case, as you say, she is the best. She's the best at half pipe and big air, which are amazing. If you haven't seen them, watch them. They're amazing. And in fact, there were fusses about other Chinese American athletes. There was Beverly Zhu, who stumbled and she didn't speak Chinese properly, and she, there was a sort of minor fuss about her in the sense that Chinese social media told her to go back to America. So I think it's quite difficult for all these athletes who are straddling 2 nationalities.
Yeah, I mean, that's maybe something that's true of all sports people, Alok, if you have dual nationality, is at some point someone's going to accuse you of betraying the other side, and that's just in the nature of tribalism when it comes to supporting sport.
So I'm not a huge fan of sports. I mean, I see them and appreciate them in some respects, but I don't understand much about them. And you're right, tribalism from my external view is part and parcel of the whole thing, and you sort of attach yourself to something. Often, if it's a football team, just because of where you happen to be born or where your parents are born. So, it's not like there's anything wrong with deciding you're going to support one thing or another. Now, of course, what Eileen Gu did to represent China has an added dimension, given that the US and China are basically at some sort of economic war right now. And they're competitors, they're sort of decoupling from each other, they're accusing each other of all sorts of things. I mean, America accuses China of human rights abuses, and people are criticizing Eileen Gu for representing a country that has documented human rights abuses. I think it's unfair, to be honest, to lump an entire country's political behaviour at the feet of an 18-year-old sports star. I think it's completely unfair. And she has said in interviews that when she's in America, she feels American, and when she's in China, she feels Chinese. I mean, what? I totally get that. As someone who was born in India but is British, I get that distinguish and that ability to sort of think differently in different places. And I think it's really unfair to force people who had to move countries or whose parents are born in different places to just say you are one and that you're an enemy if you're something else. I mean, it's just wrong.
Well, you two as well, Abdul, on this show at least, kind of represent two nations, don't you? Britain and Syria, or three if you include Hong Kong, where you're broadcasting from today. And actually that can be a real benefit, can't it? If this could be looked at a different way, not through a lens of patriotism, but through a lens of extending understanding, you'd sort of think it would be quite good to have a Chinese-American athlete that both countries could get behind.
Well, I think that one of the reasons that Americans got really upset about it is that because she didn't represent their team and she didn't win gold for them. Instead, she trained in the United States. She was born and raised there, and then she kind of defected and went to China. But I wouldn't really blame her. I mean, she went there and she got all the money there. Of course, she got amazing training in the United States, and we see a lot of athletes win. But it's also on the other side, this is, what happens when your parents are from different countries and you are born in a different country and you start moving around. And we will see this coming over and over again. For me, I will never represent Syria because I hate the regime. It was a reason why I became a refugee. But, people move for salary and for better jobs and better life. And that's what she did. Amir Khan, a very famous boxer, he is British and Pakistani, but he never represented Pakistan. But he always carries out the flag. I don't think he would have any chance to represent Pakistan. But it's a great that he was born in a country that gave him a chance to compete and become an athlete.
Yeah, but that issue of hating the regime, Theo, I mean, that's what Americans are upset about, isn't it? Why hasn't she publicly said she does hate the Chinese regime, or at least some of their actions? Why didn't she say something about the alleged genocide of Uyghurs? Why didn't she talk about human rights abuses? Do you think that's legitimate, or do you think, to return to what Alok is saying, it's just simply unfair to ask someone of her age, who is a sports person, to get involved in that political discussion?
Well, I think, as Alok said, she's 18 and it's a lot to ask her to do. On the other hand, she clearly made, or she and her mother, her family, made quite a complicated decision. Basically, she had American citizenship originally. She now has Chinese citizenship as well. If you make that decision, and she did compete for the US in 2018, 2019. So if you make that decision, then, you're going to have to go up and talk about it a lot. And what seems to me to be quite difficult about it is that, she says that she gives all this kind of, this sort of slightly Miss Worldy type sort of, she says, I hope that through my pursuit of extreme sport, I could enhance interaction, understanding and friendship between the Chinese and American people. Whereas actually what happens is that every time she goes out, she gets asked about human rights abuses, in the Uyghurs, which doesn't seem sort of diplomatically like a brilliant position to end up in.
And Alok, do you think that the hypocrisy that was highlighted by those Fox News polemicists is relevant, which is that if a Chinese-born American wanted to represent the States, they'd be unlikely to be celebrated in China, to put it mildly. So why would you expect Americans to embrace this woman?
I mean, framing anything from the point of view of a Fox News host is probably going to be problematic, I think, especially when it comes to...
Yeah, but do they have a point on that? Like, the rhetoric aside, do they have a point?
What I'm trying to say is that it forces you into a defensive posture, is what I'm saying. I think that Fox News and other capital P patriot types in America will be using this just for, not because of Eileen Gu, she could be anybody, but it's just another way to rile up their base and get views and things. And, fine, that's what they do. It's because it's China. It's because of the competition that the government has. I mean, if this was Germany...
But exactly, but that is their point, isn't it? It doesn't work both ways. China wouldn't respect an American athlete who defected in that way.
Of course, but that's just because of the position of the countries, right? And I think, if you're going to ask her, and fair enough, if anyone wants to ask her about human rights abuses, I think that, she's made a complicated decision, as Theo has said, and I think that it's completely fair to ask her about this sort of stuff. Whether you can justifiably ask her, get her to sort of respond, is a different matter. But, if you're going to go for powerful institutions and people that trade with China, talk about Apple, talk about any of the other electronics companies, talk about the fact that most of us have our products made in China. I mean, we're all sort of a little bit hypocritical if we're sort of criticizing somebody for doing something which is basically their birthright in the first place.
I mean, Abdul, you chose this as your story of the week. Why do you think it is significant?
I chose this story because it was really interesting for me to see how dual nationals are treated when they are famous and when they choose to make a decision in order to make more money. The way that she was being called a traitor and not loyal in the United States, it was funny to me because I know I will never be famous. I couldn't be a bowler or an athlete. But, if one day I became famous and decide, for example, to represent the UK, not Syria or any other country, and then people treat me like this, I would find it a little bit, upsetting. And I think, she was, right to choose a country because that was financially better. And she's 18. So if you're an 18-year-old and you decided to do what you love and get paid millions of money, you wouldn't really think about a lot of different stuff. I know, Olly, you wouldn't. You wouldn't go, for example, to some countries and work for their state media, but other people would do that.
Well, my ethics are beyond reproach. I think that's obvious. Alok, you'll be next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is extraordinary support in extraordinary times. It's the knowledge and expertise to harness opportunities. Can do is empowering you to get your plans back on track. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Okay, Alok, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
How the tails of lizards work.
Lizards are the most closely related animal to humans that can regenerate cartilage and spinal cord and muscle. And we share a lot of the same genes with them. So we're interested in looking at the genes that are involved in that regenerative process so we could apply that to human therapies in the future.
Elizabeth Hutchins from the School of Science at Arizona State University back in 2016. Alok, what's been going on in the world of lizards this week?
Well, you probably know that lizards can lose their tails and regrow them. I mean, they're not the only animals that they can regrow parts of themselves. And lots of animals sort of sacrifice parts of themselves to get away from predators. So, spiders can let go of legs, crabs can drop their claws, and some sea slugs can actually completely decapitate themselves to get rid of their bodies if they're infested with all sorts of parasites.
Okay, so far this sounds like a slow news day. What's happened this week?
This is a trait called autotomy. And what the scientists I'm going to be talking about, what they did was try and work out the physics of how it actually works. So, you heard there about the fact that it's controlled by various genes and all that sort of stuff. But physically, how does the tail of a lizard manage to stay on for most of its life and not get pulled off? But then when it needs to pull off, it comes off really quickly. And what is it about the forces and the cells and things in there that allows it to happen? So they did a bunch of experiments to look at very carefully what the interface of the tail that's come off and the rest of the animal looks like and how that works. The idea being that once you can understand this, you can actually then try and recreate that in materials that we might want to use to stick to things in certain times.
Yeah, Abdul, I don't know if you were as transfixed by this video on YouTube as I was, but there is something very compelling about watching scientists pull lizards' tails off and film them in slow motion, isn't there? I watched it a few times.
There's another, I think, YouTube video that shows feeding, where they feed animals. There are ethical issues in here, of course. You'll find always, whenever you do something nowadays, you will offend some people, object to whatever they're doing. But according to these scientists, what they're doing is that they're trying to study these lizard tails in order to produce some kind of cure or some kind of way to help people who have lost limb. And according to the NHS, there are between 55,000 and 60,000 receiving some kind of care, and that costs around £60 million a year. So if that helps, why not?
I mean, it feels like an outside bet, doesn't it, Theo, that studying how a lizard's tail attaches might ultimately end up with a way of us developing new prosthetic attachments. But then I guess, studying birds eventually led to aeroplanes, didn't it? So maybe it isn't so ridiculous.
Yeah, I think that's very speculative, that bit, isn't it? That they're sort of thinking about that in the sort of very long term future. I see this more as just the sort of, the endless thing with science of just thinking, God, how does that work? And oh right, and it is genuinely interesting. They need their tails for balance and storing fat and attracting mates and other important things like that. And their tails are mostly very well attached to them, but they also have the special trick where they can turn it sideways. And the fact that they've now analysed the biology and the physics of that, I think that's pretty amazing, and who knows what it will lead to.
How long does it take for the tail to grow back, by the way, Alok?
Several weeks, and it's not exactly the same tail that they started with. It's a slightly different composition. I mean, the couple of points raised there by Abdul and Theo, in terms of the ethics of this, of course, experimenting anything on animals is something which you have to do very carefully, and you don't just do just for the fun of it.
But you do film for YouTube and put ambient music on the background.
Well, so this New York University study is in Abu Dhabi, and you would assume, like all good universities, there was an ethical review board that actually looked at the proposal and decided, well, what are the benefits there's going to be for the research industry, research community, and so on. And you wouldn't do it just for fun. Now, the thing about lizards is that if they pull their tails off, they do grow back. It's a thing they do. So it's not like you're causing it some sort of massive distress that it wouldn't otherwise recover from. So it does recover. So just to talk about why you want to do this, it's not really necessarily right now for humans to regrow limbs and things. I mean, people are looking at the genes that control these things in lizards that allow you to regrow parts of yourself, so regenerate organs and things in some animals. And so if we can learn how certain cells in these animals do it, then perhaps we can program our own cells to do something similar. That's the long-term research goal. In this case, what it is that, as you said, the tail sticks on when it needs to stay on, and then it comes off very quickly when it needs to. So you might want to use that for, say, for example, if you have a device that needs to climb up a wall, but then needs to come off again very quickly. You might understand, if you can understand the sort of physics behind the tail of the lizard and how it manages it, and kind of what forces it applies and what kind of structures it has at the end of each thing, then you can reproduce that. And the researchers here found that the lizard's tail is actually, it's a bit like, they've got tiny microstructures on the end, which look a bit like the toes of geckos. So geckos have these really, really sticky toes. That means they can scale smooth vertical walls, get away from things really quickly, but then also jump off whenever they need to. You can use that. You can imagine some sort of Spider-Man character in the military using that, but also, if you want to attach a prosthetic limb, a plastic prosthetic limb, for example, onto your arm, and then be able to take it off quickly and easily without having sticky glue or weird, difficult straps and things. It's just something that allows you to sort of manipulate things much more easily.
And it seems kind of basic, though, the idea of, lizards shed their tails, so let's take a tail and put it in, I suppose, prior to this, in an X-ray or under a microscope, now in an MRI or whatever. That seems quite basic. I was kind of surprised in a way that hadn't been done before, that scientists didn't know how lizards did that.
There's an entire universe of things that hasn't been done. That's the thing about scientific research. So a lot of people have looked at the genetics behind this. When it falls off, what is it about the cells, biological cells, in those parts of the lizard's tail or the gecko's toe, feet and everything that allows it to do those things? But in terms of the physics, that's a different bunch of people. Physicists don't usually work with animals like this. So what they're doing here is to, in this case, what they didn't use anything more sophisticated than a high frame rate camera, like a camera that recorded 3,000 frames per second, to look at exactly what the shapes of the cells were and how the shapes of the cells sort of attached to other shapes of cells and things. They weren't really interested in the biology of this. They were looking at just the physics of it. And that's just not been done before. I mean, there's many, many areas like this. I'll bring more stories like this in the future.
That's so interesting, isn't it, Abdul? Physicists don't usually work with animals. I mean, you work in a university. Is that a problem that it's so compartmentalised? Does the best stuff happen when different departments do collaborate?
A number of departments try to bring people from different departments. There are some kind of programs like this, but it doesn't really work if it's, external bodies trying to arrange for something. Usually it's people with interest. Most of the things that we see in England is that people meet at the pub and then talk about it over drinks, and ideas start from there. But usually most of the academics really hate things when they come from top down, and hate it when people try to ask them to collaborate with other departments and produce something. There's a lot of paperwork. But if you've got friends in another department and you got an idea, say, hey, let's do this, and then you can go get over the paperwork. Sometimes it happens, it works.
And Theo, this research, as Alok said, came out of NYU in Abu Dhabi. As we discussed when you were on the show last time, you grew up in the UAE partly, and these sort of international franchises of prestigious Western institutions have been criticised, haven't they, as exercises in filling the coffers for those institutions, basically. But do you think research like this validates the contribution they can make?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, I don't see that strengthening academic outposts around the world and having different links between different places. I don't see that's ever going to be a bad thing. I think Abu Dhabi, to its credit, has decided to invest heavily with its oil money in education, the arts, all these things. And, I've no doubt that will be, really helpful for it in the long run.
Which is quite interesting, isn't it? Because the impetus apparently was literally the scientists who were there kind of on their lunch breaks and stuff were looking at these lizards and thinking, well, how do they work? Which, of course, wouldn't happen in New York.
There are a lot of lizards in Abu Dhabi.
Well, that's exactly it, wasn't it? That they were looking at outside and they were overrun with lizards, and they just saw this tail shedding happening, and kind of just in their heads, researchers went, hang on, well, why does that actually happen? And plenty of great scientific discoveries start like that. Nobel Prize winning discoveries start like that. And I just want to say what's interesting about this work, and what I find interesting, is that nature has some amazing things that it does. Lots and lots of amazing things. And, we try and mimic it in all sorts of ways to understand how to, make our products better, how to make our lives better. And, if you can see that in nature something happens, that it's possible, that it physically is possible, and therefore it gives you a target to try and do that by yourself. I mean, humans have invented lots of amazing things too, but nature does even more amazing things.
Is there a better example than what I said about looking at birds and then developing aeroplanes? Because I did see you grimace when I said that. Is that true? I assumed it's true.
I just want to know if it's true.
I was watching a goose take off the other day and it looked a bit like a plane, so I assume other people have thought that.
Aeroplanes don't fly anything like birds. They don't flap their wings or anything. I mean, that just didn't work. the aerodynamics of a plane is totally different to the aerodynamics of a... But if you know that for a fact, Olly, I'm going to trust you.
I'm prepared to say that other people in previous generations have had the same thought that I have looking at a bird. Theo, we'll be coming to you next after this. All right, Theo, you are ending the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This is the week that we learnt a major vibe shift was coming.
All right, number one, for weeks now, I could smell it in the air. I could feel it in my bones. Sometimes I got the chills, and that's when I knew a vibe shift was coming, and we should all be ready for it. Vibe forecaster Sean Monahan predicted it was coming. And we've had the hipster vibe in 2003, the post-internet vibe in 2010, and the woke vibe. So what's the NBT? Larry, and next big thing there?
Thank you.
I'm calling it now. It's the YDYB. You do you, boo. That's a vibe.
Yeah.
Chicago's WGN TV reporting on Wednesday this week. Theo, first of all, what is a vibe shift, but also what is a vibe forecaster? How is that a job?
So the reason this story has come up is because there was an article in New York Magazine that went pretty viral. Basically, it's about this guy called Sean Monahan, who is a trend forecaster, as you said. So he's most famous for, in the 2010s, naming the phenomenon of normcore, which is basically dressing like Larry David or Jerry Seinfeld and wearing like grey trainers and stuff. And I have to say, although, you know, he is actually pretty good at his job from what I can tell. And the vibe shift is an idea. I mean, it's a sort of fancy word for quite a simple idea that in the culture sometimes things change and a once dominant social wavelength starts to feel dated suddenly.
Like what?
So the example that he gives in the piece that he wrote, which was being discussed in this article, is that one day everyone was wearing Red Wing boots and partying in warehouses in Williamsburg decorated with twinkling fairy lights. Then, vibe shift. Everyone suddenly started wearing Nike Frees and sweating it out in the club. So like a classic vibe shift, something suddenly, almost overnight, people start behaving in different ways culturally.
Okay, I mean, that does feel very New York, doesn't it? I mean, it's very specific. Is it an international vibe shift? What are the sort of macro trends that come out of these micro trends?
Well, I think, you know, it obviously is in you. These stories are to a certain extent about very fashionable people in New York. But I think, you know, rather as in the famous speech in The Devil Wears Prada, eventually they get down to us normies and muggles as well. So, you know, they kind of, you know, they decide. So the basic thing is that there are all these different trends. These people have decided that things are, at the moment, what you've got, the dominant thing for the last few years has been what he calls hype beast stroke woke, which is like what I love about the story is the mixture of things that are really not very well connected to each other, which are all part of he thinks the same vibe.
Yeah, so
like,
trans rights and trainers.
Yeah, Drake, sneaker flipping, virtue signalling, you know, cancel culture. Those are all the things, and those things are now going. And instead, also things like filtered selfies, Peloton bikes, having babies, all those things are going off. And instead, he thinks he's not quite sure. No one really knows what the next vibe's going to be, which is the difficult thing. But he's suggesting American apparel, flash photography at parties, messy hair, messy makeup, irony, decadence, and not so much social media.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, Abdul, with this huge news happening in Russia, Ukraine this week, you know, tectonic plates actually shifting, that something that seems as frivolous as the fashions that you wear and the music that you're into being impacted by what's going on in the world is being discussed, but the two things could be linked, couldn't they? You know, when a big thing happens, I mean, I suppose COVID was the last big thing, obviously. When COVID happened, perhaps it was inevitable that we'd move into a different conversation online and a different cultural moment.
Whatever happens is going to lead to some kind of a change. Like, can you believe it that there is something now called refugee style? What is refugee style, if you might ask? I will tell you. A refugee style is a cafe decorated as if it's a war scene, you know, where the walls are kind of bare, they're just like bricks, and you can see the wires in them. And then you would see people going to these cafes and taking pictures. And these are very trendy cafes in China right now. And a lot of people, when they say, we're going to decorate our house, and you ask them how, they said, oh, refugee style. And they said, like, I'm an expert. I am a refugee. Pay me money, and I will do some consultation for a decoration.
So, but that's a trend that means stripped back, basically. Like, they think it's more authentic somehow?
I don't think it's called authentic, but they literally call it, that's literally the name, refugee style. That's the literal name for it. But again, it's a style. They pay money to decorate the cafes to look like this. And I was like, yo, this is my life for free. Pay me money. I will do some consultation for you.
But maybe it's not so ridiculous to say, I mean, that sounds a preposterous trend, don't get me wrong, but maybe it's not so ridiculous to say that an increased number of refugees led to refugee style. I mean, that's the point I'm getting at. International events may impact our fashions.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The international events will impact our fashion design, one way or another. Again, the refugee crisis created something called refugee style. I don't know if Russia's now, invasion of Ukraine is going to, create something else. But something will happen because these events, all the vibes shift from one to another, like TikTok or all these, apps that we do are based on something that is, happening in real world.
Do you sense a vibe shift is coming, Alok?
So I'm very unaware of any shifts because I'm quite unaware of the world, having two small children. That's all I'm aware of. But I'll tell you something. With refugee style, refugee vibe, whatever it's called, Abdul, I'm almost certain, I mean, I don't want to be too much of a cynic here, but I'm almost certain the people requesting refugee style don't really want refugee style. What they want is sort of appear to be sort of appreciative of something different to themselves, but actually they don't want the real refugee style, which they would find very objectionable and horrible to themselves. And it's a filter on your life, I suppose, isn't it? Now, I think I've missed all the previous vibe shifts or vibe motions and things, and so I think that's where I'm coming from. But I will say one other thing, which is vibe forecasters are going to vibe forecast. They're going to need to make money. They're going to need to talk. And I think that as soon as we're used to this next vibe, whatever it is, there's going to be a new one. And I think I'm still in the 1990s vibe, and I'm not quite sure I've ever left.
Yeah, but that's quite interesting, isn't it? So the article was saying in New York Magazine, Theo, that when there's a vibe shift, people get left behind, and maybe it's all right to be left behind. It's a bit like the Queen Mum, choosing her fashion moment in the 1920s and then always looking like that. I mean, I'm basically dressed how I would have been in 2008. Is that what happens? You sort of find your vibe when you're sort of 30-odd and stick with it?
Yeah, I think that's right. That basically, it's got quite a Darwinian view about the vibe shifts. What happens is that these things happen, and some people just don't make it through, and they get stuck on the other side, and maybe they have to go to the suburbs and have babies or something like that. And yeah.
But then that's the culture wars then, isn't it? I mean, that's actually quite a significant thing that we talk about all the time in the last vibe, if that moment has passed, is the kind of the woke divide between generations, and to an extent, some older people almost being helpless to not understand what's going on.
So I mean, obviously this is a very frivolous story, and it is, full disclosure, one that we chose before Putin launched a major invasion on a European democracy. But I think there is actually there is a bit of wisdom in it here, which is that basically there are fashions in everything, and everything, to a certain extent, these things are, we talk about the culture wars, to a certain extent these are based on real social conditions, which are very important, and to a certain extent they are based a bit on people going, I'm into this now, or actually I'm not into this anymore, I've changed my mind. And that is that there are fashions in intellectual life, there are fashions in politics, there are fashions in warfare. Fashion is a very, very important thing, in terms of analysing anything to do with human behaviour. And I think that I'm sure there will be a bit of a swing away from cancel culture and the sort of Puritanism. That's a classic thing that happens, isn't it? You go from Puritanism and then you go back to decadence or rebellion or whatever. And I'm sure we'll get a bit of that. Your
parents were liberal, you're conservative, etc.
For sure, yeah. It's what our man Sean Monaghan calls the patricidal waves of culture vibe shifts or something like that.
You mentioned earlier that cancel culture might be over. I mean, I don't think I can't see that getting anything other than worse in places like America. If there is a vibe shift going on, I think most of America and increasingly parts of Britain as well haven't got that memo.
But Monaghan's memo seems to be that maybe if you're 19 or 20, you just see it as a bit passé. It's not that it's going anywhere; it's that the people that are involved in it are older. And the younger people think, that's what the last generation did. Sure,
if he's got evidence of that, then I'm very optimistic and happy that that's true. But it doesn't seem to be very clear, very much so right now. I mean, younger and younger people seem to be much more into the idea of safe spaces and not offending others and all those things, which comes from a good place, but also has led to kind of a polarization right now in American politics and other places that is quite disturbing. And again, I don't want to make this too serious because obviously it is slightly frivolous. But what Theo said is correct: is that even though it is frivolous, it might just reflect something going on at some serious level. And I think we should take note of these things and not dismiss them. And if people are seeing things in a different way and all of that, I think that the brilliance of human nature and the way it works best is if we completely see that other people might see the world differently to you, right? And kind of take it in a bit of a light-hearted way. And I think that that's exactly the right way to deal with this, rather than taking everything super seriously all the time.
It reminded me of the Onion's headline after September 11th, which was, "A shattered nation longs to care about stupid bullshit again."
Yeah, well, that was Charlie Brooker's thing when Brexit happened and Trump, wasn't it? Do you remember when everything used to be a little bit meh? When people used to just sort of shrug their shoulders at the news and not be engaged. That was a vibe shift. And Abdul, the problem may be with people self-identifying with these vibe shifts and saying, well, yes, I'm part of this and I'm not part of that. It's a bit like saying I'm a hipster or I'm a geriatric millennial or whatever, is that you are defining other people as not part of your conversation, and that can be quite alienating.
Yeah, well, you can define people according to the circles you hang around with, right? So you can tell people that these are kind of like 2008 or whatever. These were, I think, I remember when I was growing up. But when I arrived in England, I completely missed out. I'm still missing out on a lot of vibe shift, and I really don't understand a lot of them. I was really happy that I'm now included in one called Refugee Style. And I'm really excited about it. But other than that, whatever people identify themselves, like, yeah, happy, whatever. As long as I get paid, I can see myself for the first time not being used as kind of an insult or in a negative connotation. I'm really happy about it.
Well, it is time now for the ultimate vibe shift to silence. As I thank Alok, Abdul and Theo for their stories. We will be back next week. And remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And by the way, if you're looking for something to listen to right now, once this episode is over, why not sample The Overview, the new podcast from the week's digital team? It is a guide to the past, present and future of news, bringing you the stories you'll wish you already knew about. Regular Week Unwrapped panellists Julia and Leaf are on the new episode, asking some experts why books are still being banned. You can follow that show now, The Overview from the week, wherever you get your podcasts. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week,